Hello, my name is Marissa Bell and I'm a late-stage PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at the University at Buffalo. Today I'm going to talk about one component of my dissertation research on nuclear waste siting in Canada. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about one aspect of energy justice that centres on the recognition of voices within an energy landscape, which I'll be focusing to nuclear waste siting. Nuclear energy has been argued to be part of the energy transition towards a low-carbon economy. And even if you don't hold that view, there is still a significant amount of nuclear waste that already exists and that we have to do something with. It follows that nuclear waste storage is an integral and critical component of energy transitions and associated landscape transformations. Gavin Bridge and colleagues in their Geographies of Energy Transition paper noted that some of the fiercest contemporary struggles around energy transition centre on the creation of new reservoirs and depositories, such as for carbon and nuclear waste. While some have argued that there are technical issues to waste storage, the fierce struggles and the greatest barrier has been argued to be social and political acceptance. A number of countries have struggled with this. Here in the US, we've had Yucca Mountain controversy and the associated political failures. Canada has also had its fair share of problems with social and political acceptance. Canada for decades has been working on its storage solutions for high-level nuclear waste. Following the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act in 2002, Canada's government created the Nuclear Waste Management Organisation, or NWMO, which was tasked with finding a solution for Canada's spent fuel. And after 3 years of studies and public consultation, the NWMO designed a process called adaptive phase management, which really centred on finding an informed and willing host to build a deep geologic repository. And their mission equally prioritises social acceptance within this methodology. So their mission is to develop and implement collaboratively with Canadians a management approach that is first and foremost socially acceptable, also technically sound, environmentally responsible, and economically feasible, but it really puts social acceptability at the forefront as a priority. Following 3 years of consultation and study, in 2010, the NWMO began publicising their process to municipalities through mayoral conferences and as such. By 2012, 22 municipalities had indicated officially their interest in being engaged in this process and potentially hosting a deep geologic repository. By 2017, when I began my study, there were 5 sites still under consideration. Others had been discounted due to geologic reasons or other reasons indicated. So the 5 sites are indicated in blue. As of January 2020, there are 2 sites under consideration. These are indicated in red, one in Northern Ontario, Ignace, and the other in Southern Ontario, South Bruce. When I was conducting field research between 2017 and 2019, I looked at 2 municipalities that were still at that time in the process, Huron-Kinloss and South Bruce, indicated in the yellow circles and indicated in the yellow starred box. So just a little bit of context. Bruce County is about 100 kilometres west of Toronto, situated on the shoreline of Lake Huron. The region has one of the largest nuclear power plants in the world, Bruce Power Generating Plant, with 8 reactors and some currently being refurbished. It has a somewhat diverse population with some strong Mennonite communities, a strong Indigenous population, which currently have land claims over much of Bruce County. The region has an economy driven predominantly by the nuclear power plant, in addition to some agriculture and tourism. Also, notably, there was a second facility proposed for the storage of low and intermediate level nuclear waste, which has now been reconsidered. But so my aim was to study the process of waste siting, specifically for spent fuel, looking at how consent was being addressed and measured in the NWMO's process. And this region is where I did my field research between May 2017 and May 2019, in both Huron-Kinloss and South Bruce. So I participated in and observed local and regional meetings and conducted over 40 in-depth interviews with community members, advocates, local officials, nuclear experts, and practitioners of the nuclear waste siting policy in the region. So what I'll be focusing on today centers around the research question of how and to what extent have divergent voices been recognized in the nuclear waste siting process. There are a couple of important concepts that I draw from in my conceptual framework. The first is the concept of landscapes. These are spaces influenced by the geographical spatiotemporal processes, social actors, and materiality, the technologies, infrastructures embedded in them. Landscapes help us figure out which voices lay claim to the land and the different relationships this produces, and therefore the different expertise that can result from those relationships. There is the concept of recognition, and this is the extent to which people are respected, included, and valued in a process of decision-making. This is from the environmental justice literature, from which the energy justice literature emerged. Together, the concepts of landscapes and recognition help us to get to the questions of consent. Who has the right to consent? What is consent? And how is it operationalized and measured? These concepts are informed by a variety of literatures, including energy geography, landscape studies, science and technology studies, and energy justice. I've organized the results into two main themes that I'd like to highlight today. The first is the problem of defining a radius for voices of consent, and the second is the nature of the nuclear community and how that informs inclusion. Discussions often revolved around how to delineate consent, including what is the radius of consent. And so this means two things: spatially, in terms of the physical extent, and temporally, how to include future generations. In their guiding principles, the NWMO cites the concept of inclusiveness. Within this, they dictate some guidelines for spatial delineation. For example, they state that they must respond to surrounding communities, provincial governments, Aboriginal communities, and even those on transportation routes. So there's some foundation for this discussion. Nevertheless, it still remains quite vague and non-specific. A number of respondents highlighted concerns regarding the inclusion of international US neighbours in the process. And furthermore, NWMO official reports and documentation contain very little, if any, reference to international discussions of consent. So actually, a number of resolutions have been passed, both within Canada, but also within the US surrounding the Great Lakes. These resolutions have been opposing the low and intermediate level nuclear waste facility, but this indicates that similar results may be expected regarding the high-level waste siting. So as you can see, there are a range of temporal issues of how far to delineate the boundaries of consent. Then there is also the problem of temporal delineation. A number of community stakeholders raised the issue of counting for future generations, perhaps those that aren't even born yet. When asked who is excluded from this process, a community resident said, well, what about our grandchildren, the unborn, and the ones who tend to be most aware of the unborn typically are women. So this points as a way to navigate this issue, suggesting increased involvement of women in the process. But it also leads us to a practical reality, that women, for whatever reason, tend to be less vocal in this process and less represented. Numerous times in my research, when I would ask people to participate, women would direct me to their male counterparts, husbands, brothers, or sons, who have perhaps followed the project more closely, or perhaps simply know more about the project, know more about nuclear energy in general. And this gap is obviously problematic. And one thing that is unique to being within a nuclear community is that a substantial portion of the population may be more familiar with nuclear topics. And so this brings me to the relevant second theme that I wanted to touch on. And this is the notion of a nuclear community. How is a nuclear community produced, and how that influences recognition and inclusion. So as I mentioned before, this region is home to Bruce Nuclear Power Plant. It is the most dominant employer in the area, directly and indirectly driving economic growth in the region. And this nuclear dominance makes the region a nuclear community by virtue of the sheer number of people employed by the nuclear industry, and also reliance on that industry. As a result of that, there is more knowledge, expertise of nuclear, more familiarity, more trust, and a sense of pride in nuclear. Research tells us that existing nuclear communities tend to be more accepting of new nuclear industrial activities. We know this from the likes of the nuclear oasis hypothesis and others. And so this seems like a recipe for success. People are familiar with nuclear, comfortable, even nonchalant. However, there are two main issues with this. Because the majority in this region are comfortable and supportive of nuclear, and the economic benefits it brings, this may positively influence overall perception, but it has a dampening effect, or has the potential to have a dampening effect, on executing voice. People might be unwilling to speak up for fear of facing a backlash. So as one community resident, also a business advocate, said, "It's a very small community. People are conscientious of rocking the boat. So I think they don't want to be the first to have voiced concerns about things. It's going to bring a lot of economic prosperity to the area. And if it goes ahead, people don't want to be responsible for the downfall of that not happening." The second issue is that the production of a cohesive nuclear community has a way of excluding certain voices, and I'll explain two examples here. Indigenous groups have historically and contemporarily been excluded from nuclear decision-making. They were excluded regarding the siting of Bruce Nuclear Power Plant back in the 60s, and they were excluded in the initial proposed siting of the low-level waste facility in Kincardine in 2002, although subsequently fought for their right for a say in the process. And this is acknowledged by those within the nuclear industry, who recognise that Canada has a tense history with Indigenous engagement. But there has been progress in this regard, and the NWMO has done a lot to engage Indigenous groups in what they call interweaving Western science with Indigenous knowledge. An NWMO representative discusses an example of this. In response to feedback from First Nations and local community members who had concerns for the water and proximity to the lake, the NWMO came up with their Journey of Water presentations. These merge concepts from both Western science and traditional Indigenous knowledges. The second example is one that hasn't quite been as adequately addressed, and that is of marginalised critical voices, those critical of the nuclear industry or nuclear waste siting. So not only are people reluctant to voice their opinions, but when they do get voiced, they often feel disrespected and marginalised. A number of interviews revealed a perception that those critical of the process are simply uneducated. An NWMO representative explains that while they enjoy hearing critical views, they find that community liaison members have found the critics who have spoken at public meetings to not be very credible. They didn't really have any credentials or publications behind their name. So then it was like, okay, well, were they just questioning this stuff? And I don't know how valuable they found it. So this points back to the well-known lay-expert divide within the nuclear industry. The nuclear experts deny risks, while critical publics amplify risks. And this stems from deficit model thinking that the public irrationally fear nuclear because they have a deficit of knowledge. And that if we can just educate the public, we can change their perceptions, something that has been widely disproven. And so coming back to the concept of landscapes, it really helps us to understand how we might think about integrating communities into energy transitions in just ways. Landscapes help us identify social actors, their relationships to the land, which give them expertise, and how we might recognize those and better integrate diverse perspectives into decision-making, and therefore identify consent. So I've highlighted some of the ways in which there's been progress in terms of inclusivity, but issues remain. The main takeaway is that in order to recognize voices within the process, there should really be attention to landscapes of consent. Institutions and siting processes might benefit from being more attentive to the geographic context, the history, the concurrent processes, social and political dynamics and relations, and the voices in that context. From there, we can also understand what voices might get lost or how voices might be lost, demeaned, or disrespected. And landscapes help us do this and identify this more holistically. Once we've identified voices, we can then begin to integrate diverse perspectives within that context. The next step is then to set up procedures, context-specific mechanisms to facilitate the recognition of voice. For example, drawing from my themes and examples from my research, mechanisms that promote inclusivity, such as diversifying gender on decision-making bodies, involving younger generations in decision-making, but really integrating mechanisms that have concrete strategies for involving neighbouring communities. Right now, these processes are very vague. Fluidity and adaptability is a strength, but vagueness and ambiguity can be weaknesses. And so while I've really outlined some important things to bear in mind when designing siting processes for nuclear waste, this really kind of relates to the siting of any large infrastructure and decision-making in general. Thank you all very much for your attention during this presentation, and I look forward to questions during the live Q&A.